Senator Wallace, followed by Senator Milne.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for your presentations. Mr. Plecas, I might ask you the first question and then one for Professor Sheehy. Mr. Plecas, as you, undoubtedly having read Bill C-15, it's evident that the focus of C-15 is to, in some way, attempt to effectively address drug production, drug trafficking issues as they relate to organized crime, and in particular, as they relate to the protection of our youth. And as you probably have seen, there are provisions in the bill that deal with aggravating factors which would attract the mandatory minimum if drug trafficking and production directly impacts our youth, and in particular in and around schools. And I'm wondering if any comments you might make about how you see the effectiveness of Bill C-15 as relates to those two components, organized crime, and in particular our youth and the protection of our youth and the schoolyards that our youth are in, and what your experience has been with in British Columbia with the impact of drug trafficking on our youth.
I'm not so sure that we should have a concern about the schoolyard thing and how close they are to a schoolyard. I'm not sure there's that much of a connection there at all. Although there is a recent study, 209 study, I'm not sure it's available outside of academia right now, but which showed that some 12% of youth in Quebec were involved in, or one part of Quebec were involved in grow-ops, and thinking, how does that happen? That certainly isn't the case in BC. But whoever constructed this piece of this bill, I would say, was very attentive to what are the problems. They do talk about, the association to organized crime, and that is very real. The association to harms, that's very real. Do I think it would be effective? I think there's what's very clear that right now what we're doing is not even close to being effective. That's why it continues to be a growing problem across the country. I think it would be more effective if those sentences could be longer, and I think that is to have some kind of consequence for these people, and simultaneously have them be able to participate in programs, and I'm reminded again the whole drug court thing, and although that wouldn't apply to producers at all, I don't think. There's obviously we want to do all of that, but as it stands right now, we have absolutely no consequence for people involved in something which is clearly, as is expressed in the bill, is basically it's fueling our organized crime problem, and it's what's causing us to become, as the United Nations have stated, a source country for drugs. It's just that simple.
And you would see Bill.
I'm going to interrupt here because I'm going to set up a two-track system here. As I said earlier, Professor Sheehy absolutely has to leave at noon because she has a class, and we were notified in advance of this. And I'm hoping Mr. Plecas can stay a few minutes longer.
Oh, sure.
Okay? So what I'm going to do is ask senators who have questions for Professor Sheehy in order, and then return for questions to Mr. Plecas in the same order. Did you have a question for Professor Sheehy? Go for it, and then we will have questions for her, should they be so directed, from Senators Milne, Angus, and Joyal.
Thank you.
By noon.
High noon.
All right. Professor Sheehy, thank you again for your appearance here today. You had you are very clear on your concerns about Bill C-15 and in particular mandatory minimums, the concerns you would have as they relate to minorities, African Canadians and other minorities. I didn't hear you make any reference to any groups other than minorities, and I was left with the impression that are you advocating for a two-tiered legal system that would provide certain rules for minority groups and those for the rest?
No, not at all. In fact, at the beginning of my brief, I do state my general opposition to mandatory minimum sentences for very general reasons for all people. But the thing I thought I could bring that might be of interest or different from what other presenters might bring to you is my concern with the discriminatory effects of these laws.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Milne, a question for Professor Sheehy?
Yes, I do have. Professor Sheehy, in your studies, have you looked at all of on the effect that potentially this bill could have on other ethnic minorities, given our increasing rates of immigration from places like the Middle East and India and...
Yes, well, to do this work, I had to rely on the expertise of David Tanovich, and his book, The Color of Justice, does look at profiling of other racial groups for the purposes of drug and gang activities. So there certainly are going to be implications for other racialized groups who are subject to particular scrutiny for their participation in drug transactions. But I don't have detail on that. His book identifies some of those groups and some of the evidence that they are being surveyed and profiled.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator Milne. Senator Angus, a question for Professor Sheehy?
Thank you, Chair. Ma'am, thank you very much for your testimony. I just wondered if you've been sitting there listening to also the evidence of Professor Plecas. Is it Plecas or Plecas? Plecas. And I wondered if, in terms of organized crime only, do you agree with Professor Plecas in terms of what he says about the relationship of C-15 and his suggestion that it's a positive step forward in terms of dealing with organized crime?
I don't, because I don't see us making a dent in it through these kinds of laws. I don't see us moving anywhere forward in terms of, towards a more law-abiding or peaceful society. I don't think that's going to be the result of this legislation.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Professor Senator Joya.
And call me Professor, it happens to me today. Ms. Sheehy, there are 2 points I want to raise with you. The first one is the non-application of the benefit of 718E for the Aboriginal people when there is a minimum sentence. I think that has to be very clear in the minds of honorable senators, that when we establish or impose a minimum sentence, we are excluding the Aboriginal peoples from the benefit of that section of the code. I know that you have mentioned it in your brief on page 9 on the top of the page, but I think it is very important that we understand the unintended consequence of this bill in relation to the Aboriginal population, taking into consideration that the code has managed a specific sentencing provisions for them, considering the various sociological and political situation and consideration of the bill. So could you confirm that when there is a minimum sentence, section 718(2)(e) doesn't apply to the Aboriginal people? In other words, they are excluded from the benefit of the code.
Oh, that's absolutely right. That will be the effect of the mandatory minimum sentence unless the person can fall within the clause on drug treatment court. So there is an out, and I don't know, how many people will be able to take advantage of that out. I still think it's a discretionary out for the judge. It's not an automatic out.
Well,
prosecutor.
Provided that the court existed and was available.
Yes,
because
that there is such a program, and there isn't such a program everywhere.
There are very limited drug court in this country.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's not a saving clause to
No.
put it in the terms that my colleague Senator Baker has put it at the beginning.
No. So the impact of these laws would be to tie the judge's hands. They would not be able to implement the intent behind Parliament in passing 718.2E. That's absolutely correct.
Okay. My second point is about the